hi, this is Steve Hall. Thanks for checking out video number 8 in our Veritas series. If you watched the last video, you'll recognize this diagram. We were talking about manuscript evidence. And now, what I'd like to do is take just a little bit more time to talk about some of the early church history, the evidence from early church history. So we're going to zoom in on this timeline to cover about the first 300 years of the early church. Remember, one of the reasons we're doing this is to try to help people understand that these early years of church history are filled with evidence that the New Testament we have is the same one that was written in the first century. And I want us to look at some of those events so that we'll be less likely to be confused or deceived when someone tries to rewrite early church history. That happens from time to time. So I want us to zoom in on the first 300 years after the time of Christ, and just kind of work our way backwards toward the time of Christ, building up evidence for the trustworthiness of the New Testament as we go. So as we work our way back toward the time of Christ from about 300 AD in our little imaginary time machine, the first thing we find are fragments from the four Gospels that historians have found. They're called the Chester Beatty Papyri, dated around 200 to 250 AD. So we know all four of the Gospels were in existence at that point in time. Around 200 AD, we find the Gospel of John papyri. Gospel of John is considered by everyone and has been considered from the beginning to be the latest of the Gospels, so we can assume the other Gospels were written certainly before this. We go back to 180, we find Tatian writing a harmony of the Gospels. I don't know if you're familiar with harmony of the Gospels, but they're still around today. You can find men who try to take the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and put them all together in one story. That's what Tatian tried to do, only that was 180 AD, so obviously he had the Gospels. Well, we can back up a little further to Justin Martyr, Tatian's teacher, and we find him quoting the Gospel of John in 150 AD in something called his First Apology. And then go all the way back to 130 AD, and this is something I mentioned when we were talking about manuscripts in the last video, but the John Rylands papyri, there's an actual fragment of the Gospel of John that's dated only a few decades after the time when John actually penned down the words. It's very unusual to have a papyrus manuscript that's dated that close to the original writing. We go back to about 120 AD, and we find a man named Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. John personally discipled Polycarp. He wrote a letter to the church at Philippi in 120 AD, and in that letter you see him quoting the Gospels, and you see him quoting New Testament letters. So, obviously, they were around in 120 AD. We go in a little closer to a man named Ignatius. He was the pastor at Antioch. Ignatius was discipled by both John and Peter appointed him to be the third pastor at Antioch. You remember Antioch, don't you? Antioch is referred to in Acts. We read about Paul and Barnabas ministering in Antioch just a few years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And so Ignatius is now the pastor in 110 AD, and we find letters that he's written where he's quoting, for example, the Gospel of Matthew. And then about 95 AD, as we move closer and closer to the actual time of Christ, we have a man named Clement. He was the pastor of the church at Rome. He wrote a letter to the church at Corinth in about 95 AD, and in that letter he's quoting lots of New Testament books. There's several New Testament quotes there, and he quotes from the same New Testament books we have today. 95 AD, he had the same material we have. Now let's zoom in even closer to that first century. For reference, there's Clement, 95 AD, quoting the New Testament books. When we go back to 70 AD, there's something happened that was tremendously important historically. Jerusalem was destroyed. The Roman army came in 70 AD and destroyed Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, tore down the temple. Jesus predicted all this in the Gospels. The amazing thing and the interesting thing is none of the Gospels and none of the letters that are in the New Testament refer to this. It seems logical that they might have referred to it if they were written after 70 AD. But they weren't. They were written before 70 AD, so the destruction had not happened yet. The book of Acts was written by Luke, and it was completed in the early 60s. We know that because as the book of Acts closes, Paul and Peter are both still alive. And we know that Paul and Peter both died around 64 AD. Not only that, but Luke has no mention of the war that began in 66 A.D. that led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 A.D. But Luke is a very detailed historian. You find lots of historical details in the book of Luke and in the book of Acts. And the fact that we don't see any reference to the war or the destruction of Jerusalem, or, of course, of the deaths of Peter or Paul, indicates pretty clearly that Acts was written in the early 60s. It's also interesting that Paul quotes Luke chapter 10, verse 7 in his first letter to Timothy in chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. Now, the letters that Paul wrote to Timothy were some of the last letters he wrote, but still, it couldn't have been written later than early 60s. So there's more evidence that the Gospel of Luke was already around in the early 60s. Paul wrote Galatians around 55 A.D., and when he writes Galatians, he talks about meeting Peter and James about 14 years earlier. That would be about 40 A.D. In other words, we're getting back very, very close to the days after Jesus' resurrection. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, and again he wrote 1 Corinthians 15 about the same time, in the mid-50s, he's talking about the importance of the resurrection of Jesus. And he says there in 1 Corinthians 15, look, if you doubt this, go talk to some of these eyewitnesses. There were over 500 eyewitnesses to his resurrection, and many of them are still alive. In fact, he said most of them are still alive. So go talk to them, and they can tell you about what it was like to see the resurrected Jesus. So obviously here, there is no gap. We can walk right back through history to the time of the New Testament. Well, I'm sure you get the point. The years that followed immediately after Jesus' death and resurrection are full of historical events and full of documents that all verify the New Testament account. There are no historical gaps during which the story of Jesus could have been invented or embellished. The earliest records we have the same information as the later records. We don't see any kind of development from some simple guy who was a basic, simple Jewish rabbi who became a legend and then finally became God in the flesh in the people's minds. You just don't see that. You find Jesus as God, come as man, died for our sins, rose again, conquering death, from the very first records. One other thing to remember is that the existence of over 5,000 manuscripts, and of course there were many more copies than that in the early days. We have 5,000 of them still in existence. And what that means is that thousands and thousands of documents would have had to be doctored to change that message. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not like somebody copied one copy of one document and then somebody copied one copy of that document. So if you just changed one, it would fix everything from then on. No, there are thousands of them out there. And the point is, when you read your New Testament, you can have confidence that this is the way God put it together in the first century.